Is that money going to come back, or is there a reality that needs to be accepted that officials have not so far, that it is not a realistic outcome?
The politicians for the past 5 years have not addressed the issues in terms of reforms. So none of the politicians want to bite the bullet and tell depositors that they're not going to get most of their money back.
Welcome to Year in Business. I'm excited to say that we're joined by Nasser Saidi, who is the president and chief economist at Nasser Saidi and Associates. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to get straight to the conversation around Lebanon because, we're trying to get an understanding around the credibility of the reform program. What is your top line reaction of the process so far? Are you convinced of what is going on?
Let me say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that's the best way to do it. Remember that there's a very heavy legacy. You now have a new president, a new prime minister, and when you look at the banking financial sector, a new governor at the central bank. But remember that there's a very heavy legacy of what we're talking about. Real GDP is down per capita, is down by 40%. Inflation, you've had hyperinflation. The value of the Lebanese pounds has depreciated by about 96%. You have a cash economy, which is now highly dollarized. You have poverty and inequality. Effectively, the depreciation of the pound and hyperinflation that you've had over this period destroyed the middle class. And on top of all that, there's an issue of rescuing Lebanon from being a quasi-failed state. What I mean by that is that the number one priority is security. You have to have secure borders on the north with Syria. You need to have secure borders in the south with Israel. And you need to rebuild the rule of law in Lebanon, to rebuild institutions, to rebuild the public sector, which got devastated. And last but not least, I have a very long list. We can go into that.
Yeah. We can unpack that. We're going to spend.
You have to talk about reconstruction, right? The South has
Absolutely.
been destroyed. Southern suburbs have been destroyed. So it's a long list of reforms that are required.
Okay, so let's tackle them kind of bit by bit. So you look at the tweet from the Minister of State for Administrative Reform, that's Fadi Makki. He said that Lebanon presented a united front in terms of the reform agenda. And despite global headwinds, there is strong momentum across all fronts. Despite those issues, structural reforms are there. This is an opportunity that must be seized. Do you agree with sort of the steps that have been taken? Again, you've been on the front lines of legislation and policy ideas. Your conviction matters is basically what I'm trying to get at. So are you impressed with the policy side of things and what's been done?
I think we're at the beginning of a very long road. I understand Fadi Makki, I know him. And he's talking about the structural reforms. And yes, we need the structural reforms. And it also means that you've got to look at fiscal reform, monetary policy, banking sector restructuring of the central bank, and all the institutions overseeing the government sector, as well as the banking and financial sector. What I mean by that is that you need to review the role of the Banking Control Commission, given that the banking sector failed under the supervision of the central bank and its previous governor. You need to look at a new capital market authority. And most important of all, part of an anti-corruption drive means that you have to look at a special investigations committee. And if you want to restructure the banking sector from what it currently is, which is now a zombie banking sector, which is not serving the economy, then you're going to have a banking restructuring administration, a separate bank restructuring administration. I don't believe that if you failed in terms of governing the sector, but the same people who are responsible for it should be people restructuring.
What about a potential investor conference in September? Do you think there's going to be enough interest and enough sort of aid pledges? Because we had a similar thing in 2018, right before the financial crisis for Lebanon, and they got pledges of $11 billion at this Paris conference, but pledges and actual investments, as we now know, are two very different things.
They didn't undertake the reforms, right? And as a result of that, they lost the confidence of the international community. In this case, I think what you need by September is a new agreement with the IMF. That's fundamental. And the IMF has set out a number of conditions. There were discussions last week in Washington, which Fadi Makki alluded to, that have set out what types of reforms you need. Banking secrecy reform, a bank restructuring act, talking about how you're going to fill the gap. What they mean by gap is that there's a loss of around $76 billion at the central bank. And so you have three balance sheets which are intermingled. The public sector balance sheet, the government, the banking sector balance sheet through the central bank, and the banks, right? So those three are intermingled, and you've got to find out who's going to cover the losses by the central bank. Banks took deposits from depositors that were attracted by high interest rates that the central bank was providing. They put the deposits at the central bank, and the central bank effectively, under Riyad Salami, ran a Ponzi scheme, borrowing to pay the interest just to preserve the Lebanese pound, which was highly overvalued, and then collapsed. So to resolve that. But what I want to warn is that simply resolving who pays does not mean that you have a banking sector that's going to pick up and go and support recovery. You need a recapitalization of the banks above all.
So what does that mean for, I mean, it depends what estimates you're looking at, right? The $19 billion of old hard currency that are stuck, right? These are people's savings, people's investments, people that were lured in by the high interest rates as you just laid out. The policymakers so far, from the Ministry of Economy to the central bank, they're saying this money is going to return to the people, that they're going to be able to access that.
I don't know how that's going to return, but the sums are closer to 80 billion, right? That depositors are owned. So,
okay, so whether 80 or 90, is that money going to come back? If not, how much of it is going to come back? Or is there a reality that needs to be accepted that officials have not so far, that it is not a realistic outcome at this time?
I think you have to be careful about the populism by the politicians in particular. The politicians for the past 5 years have not addressed the issues in terms of reforms. So it has been dragging on, as you know, since 2019, right? There was an occasion, we had the beginning of an agreement with the IMF. None of the conditions really were undertaken. So you're talking not just about the policymakers, you also have to look at the role of parliament and the politicians, okay? So none of the politicians want to bite the bullet and tell depositors that they're not going to get most of their money back. Let's be clear, when you have a failed banking system, you need a recapitalization of the banks by the shareholders or new shareholders coming in. My estimate is that you need about 20 billion capital in the banks in order for it to play its role, right? You can also have a bail-in by some of the depositors, not all. You don't want the smaller depositors. You want to be able to pay off the smaller depositors, say those who are about 100,000 and less. And for the larger depositors, you can offer them shares on the banks. So you have a bail-in. And third, government needs to play its role in terms of helping the banking sector recover and maybe promising depositors who have not been fully bailed in, promising them funds in the future. How could that be? I'll give you the best suggestion. Government or the state owns a lot of public assets, but they're very badly managed. So things like the casino, which is owned by the central bank, Middle East Airlines,
utilities,
telecoms, and all the rest, in my view, should be put into a national wealth fund, along with any future oil and gas that we might have. I'd love to have it run the way Singapore runs Temasek. Temasek runs the public assets, commercial public assets we're talking about. It has yielded a 14% return on average over, I think, the past 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is to reform those state-owned enterprises, make them well-governed, avoid the corruption, and then you can give depositors shares or bonds issued by the National Wealth Fund that they can get paid over a period of time. So that would be a contribution by shareholders who were the main beneficiaries of the Ponzi scheme that was run by the central bank.
Yeah.
Depositors pay something and the government pays something. So everybody contributes.
The central bank governor believes that banks can increase their capital by doing mergers, I think, is one of the ideas that have been bouncing around.
Of course.
Yeah, you're on board with that? Yeah.
Not of course, but also bringing in fresh money. I believe that if you go ahead with the reforms that we've been talking about, then I think you can attract capital from outside, and particularly from the GCC. The sums we're talking about at the end of the day, if I look at the capabilities of the GCC, are trivial. I mean, they're small. But remember that you need to think holistically. You need to think about, how do I reach macroeconomic stability, right? I need a public debt restructure. Lebanon has not addressed its external liabilities, okay? You need to restructure that, and you need to convince investors that they're going to get, even if you restructure it and say you're going to get 20 cents on the dollar, investors from outside need to be convinced that you're able to pay those 20 cents on the dollar. So you need to think holistically, but it's feasible. The danger, however, is that this government is relatively short of time. There are elections coming up in next May. So what we're talking about is a short-lived government, and you need to make sure that Parliament will actually vote all the laws that are required, and that you have the capability of undertaking the reforms. What I mean by undertaking the reforms is that there's some 50 positions of director general in the state that need to be filled. All of this has to happen more or less at the same time.
That's incredible. I mean, I want to pick up on what you said in terms of the relations with Gulf countries, because I mean, over the years, ever since Lebanon came into being, it's always had to deal with a sort of foreign interference by countries that are much larger, much more powerful, right? And the question becomes, what potential do you see in a renaissance of relations with the countries that matter in the Lebanon power matrix, right? So if we're trying to reset, maybe there can be a reset across the board with neighbors right across the front line, or with the bigger powers from east to west. Do you believe in that reset? Because the Lebanese government has been, of course, on a mission to tour some of the countries, including the Gulf, and send that message that they're here for a reset.
Yes. Let me be very clear. Relations with the Gulf are the cornerstone of Lebanon's recovery. Nobody else is going to help Lebanon except the Gulf countries. Let's be very clear on that. You'll need to have the secure borders that we mentioned before, right? With Israel and Syria. But at the same time, when you're thinking about who's going to contribute to reconstruction, who's going to help with restructuring the banking sector, it's going to be the Gulf countries. So that's a clear priority. And we've seen the president undertake visits to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and recently to the UAE. And that is a very positive message and positive direction. And I believe that they would be willing to help as long as there is no external interference in Lebanon's affairs. So that has to be set and be very clear. Once that is done, along with the economic and structural reforms that we've talked about, I think the Gulf countries will be forthcoming.
And what do you make of how the exchange rate is being managed in Lebanon? I mean, given that you spent over 15 years at the central bank, you have a sort of in-depth understanding of the nuances and dynamics that drive supply and demand for that paper. Tell me what you make of that today.
I think continuing with a fixed exchange rate policy is a mistake. Okay, people forget history. Lebanon had the longest history of a flexible exchange rate regime from 1947-48 up till 93-94. Okay, a very long history. And you need the flexible exchange rate because you're exposed to so many shocks, either internal shocks or external shocks. We live in a highly geopolitically challenging region, as you know, with lots of wars, violence, and unrest. So the best way to address that when you're a small country is to have a flexible exchange rate, okay? The exchange rate takes the brunt. So instead of having a collapse, as we did in 2019, the exchange rate would have adjusted, right? So avoid the fixed exchange rate. Make sure that as part of macroeconomic stability, you target inflation as part of monetary policy. So monetary policy, in my view, should be directed at stabilizing inflation, as it is in most countries in the world. You don't have the conditions really to stabilize and fix the exchange rates. That's not the way you want to go about.
Have you been able to determine a relative fair value of the currency today vis-a-vis the euro or the dollar, for example, or is that a bit of an impossible task?
I don't think you want to do it at this stage until you undertake the reforms. Once you undertake the reforms, I think you can then gradually float the exchange rate, and you can do this over a period of time. The question is really always of credibility. Is the banking sector sound? Have you stabilized it? Have you stabilized the fiscal sector? Have you done fiscal consolidation? Are you able to run the economy? Once you have that, then the conditions are set for freeing of the exchange rate. So I wouldn't say do it right now. No. Until such time as you have the reforms in place and until such time as you have a viable banking sector, which you don't have at the moment.
Nasser, I want to lean in on your time as a deputy governor at the Central Bank of Lebanon, which covered most of the 1990s. And I've been meaning to ask, at what point did you maybe flag to management, to Riyad Salameh, hey, this is starting to look pretty fragile? Of course, you left, way before the actual crisis hit in 2019. But back then, given that you were there for such a long time, were there red flags back then? And did you, confront the central bank governor with those? And if you did, what was his feedback?
It was still manageable in the mid-1990s, let's say till 98, 2000, that was still manageable then. The reason is that the economy was growing. You were under reconstruction. But by the time you're talking about 2002, 2003, the signals were there, right? And the borrowing was rising. And I mentioned at the time, both to Riyad and to Prime Minister Hariri at the time, that we need to think about maybe adjusting the exchange rate, having a more market-based exchange rate as opposed to a fixed exchange rate. But unfortunately, the banks, in particular the banking lobby, which is particularly strong in Lebanon, was opposed to that as well, not only Riyad Salameh, but also the banking sector. There's a fear, sometimes a fear of floating. People forget your own past and experience.
I mean, I don't blame people for being fearful, letting the exchange rate go. I mean, Egypt is a good example, right? I mean, you let it go and it started at like 16 against the dollar and now you're at, you're at 50. It's just eye-watering, and who knows how much more weakness is in there. So I can relate to that. I understand that on paper, it might make the most sense, but from sort of other stakeholders, of course, and of course people who have to make ends meet, it can be a very big ask.
No, in the case of Egypt, let's be clear, the IMF has requested this as part of their overall program, that you have a gradual floating of the Egyptian pound. In order to do that, you have to create the foreign exchange market. The banks have got to be active. Other actors have got to be active in the foreign exchange market. And you can create the conditions so that that happens. You have the monetary tools. You can use some of your reserves. You use them just for stabilizing every now and then. But the rest of it, let it float. Let there be a band. You can have a crawling peg. There are many ways to address that. But at the end of the day, you have to do it. Again, remember, we live in a region where there are multiple shocks. There are political shocks, geopolitical shocks, apart from the macroeconomic shocks.
Yeah.
Need the exchange rate to be able to adjust to that.
Okay, let's talk about the rest of the region, and specifically the revision from the IMF in terms of the growth outlook. They're saying that there's going to be a notable markdown in projections for GDP expansion. It's going to raise inflation in some countries. From the initial work that you've done, how is this going to hit Saudi Arabia, and how long can they sustain it? Obviously, they have a lot of buffers to work with, but you've been through a lot of these cycles, and you're the best man to kind of tell us, what things could look like in the coming months.
Well, you've got two things happening. The main thing, particularly for Saudi and some of the other GCC countries, is the price of oil. Are you going to go back towards maybe $60, $65? Or can you have something above $70 per barrel? That'll depend on many things, whether overall global growth will continue or decline. I think it's going to fall. What about growth in China? I think China is the main customer and client of our oil and gas. It's a major importer. Will growth in China be severely affected by the tariff wars and Trumponomics, which is currently going on? That will weaken demand, but that will weaken demand for oil. And some of the countries need more oil revenue, so they might end up pumping more oil. And the question is, what is the elasticity? If you pump, will it have a much more negative impact on oil prices, or a relatively small impact on prices? We don't know yet, because there's a great deal of uncertainty in terms of the economic outlook. But fundamentally, of course, a weaker dollar means that you're going to have higher inflation, because we import many of the goods that we consumed. On the other hand, for services such as tourism, that will help you. It cheapens the cost of tourism and visiting the countries. So it might be balanced at the end of the day.
Okay, that's an interesting take. What about the reality that you've got already a budget deficit in the kingdom in 2024 from the data that exists, and that was with $80 a barrel, right? So now if you're coming down the 60, and who knows how much further south it's going to go, that means they're going to have to, what do you think they're going to do to manage that? Is it going to be cuts or borrowing?
I think you'll have a combination. I think you'll have some borrowing, and you'll also have some cuts. Remember that if you look at Vision 2030, much has already been realized.
Sorry, I think I should have clarified. So even more cuts, right? Because we know that they've trimmed. So the question is, are there more trims to come?
Most likely, but remember that much of the objectives of Vision 2030 have already been achieved, okay? There are maybe some important projects, particularly within 2030, that you can undertake now. You want a greater role for the private sector. I think that is on the cards and part of overall policy. So I think you can have an adjustment in terms of reduced spending, but opening it up for the private sector, along with some borrowing. So I think you're going to have some combination. of the three.
One of the things that stood out to me in your research when trying to understand and gauge the impact of the geopolitical shocks coming from the Trump administration in terms of tariffs or half tariffs or no tariffs. I mean, depends on the day, on the time of day you wake up as well. But you make it clear that for the GCC, for the Gulf, securing a trade agreement with the ASEAN Free Trade Area and finalizing a long negotiated free trade agreement with China needs to be the strategic imperative. Why?
Look, you're at a time of effectively deglobalization and fragmentation. This is getting accelerated by the Trump tariffs, okay, which are making trade with the United States very difficult and very costly. What do you do to that? China is going to be diverting its trade and its investments to the rest of the world and away from the United States. So just like the United States wants to de-risk China, China is going to de-risk the United States. Okay. Now, what does that mean? I think this is a big opportunity for us to reorient our trade and think of greater integration for the GCC and the Middle East. That's one. So you take the UAE, there's some 25 CEPAs right now. We can extend those CEPAs and have free trade agreements with other countries in the Middle East, which will go for greater trade and investment integration. I think that's one. But let's be very clear. Global economic geography has shifted and is continuing to shift eastward. I think this will accelerate. Our benefits, our main benefits, will be from greater trade eastward. That's why I talk about ASEAN. The agreement with China has been under negotiation for a very long time. It's nearly finalized. The question is, do you do it now? And I think yes. There are political considerations that you need to think of. But it's clear that already China is our main economic and trade partner. It's a major investor. Now, since the US markets are going to be gradually closed, it means that China will want to increase its trade with the Asian countries and its supply chain, with the Middle East, and we're privileged to be in the position that we are a conduit to all the Middle East as well as into Africa. Mm-hmm. So if you look at it geostrategically and geographically, we can potentially be in a very sweet position.
Could be, yes, definitely. One thing that has kind of been on my mind is what is going on with EU Gulf relations, specifically EU UAE relations, because my understanding is that basically you're going to get a potential free trade agreement, right? Negotiations are underway. Can they all coexist at the same time is the question I'm trying to ask, right? Can you have, strong relations with the US, EU, and China concurrently? It sounds to me like it should be a zero-sum game in theory, no?
No, it doesn't. But remember that we are no longer in the world where your main trade partners were the EU and the US. That is no longer the world we live in right now. Our main trade partners are Asia. Yeah, they're China, Japan, Korea, and increasingly India next door to us in the GCC. So yes, you can have a free trade agreement with the EU. I don't think it's going to be as important economically and financially as moving towards ASEAN and the other countries. Remember that Europe still has a lot of protective barriers insofar as investment is concerned. They'd like to attract investment from the GCC. But for me, I'd like to see more investment here and creating the jobs here into our economies. And here, I find that the Chinese are always willing to share the technology and bring in the investments.
Okay, with that in mind, also looking at the wider impact, right? We covered Lebanon, we covered the GCC. I'm wondering about sort of the rest of the Middle East, right? So this is going to be the pain point, which is something that you have highlighted. Egypt and sort of Jordan, they're more exposed to the threat of tariffs. Again, it's not clear what final set of tariffs we have to work with, but we know that there's likely to be tariffs rather than no tariffs. So regardless of the scale of tariffs, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia is kind of the list that you put out. I mean, out of them, who's most vulnerable? Is there any way we can quantify that?
Well, there's been an estimate of around $22 billion worth.
22 billion.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, this is non-oil, right? This is non-oil.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, that's a big number for non-oil.
That's a big number, particularly for the countries you mentioned, Egypt, Jordan, and the rest. I think Jordan is very vulnerable. Egypt is also vulnerable because the tariffs could go up by more than 10%, right? For the GCC countries, much less exposure overall, because much of their oil trade is no longer with the United States. Aluminum and others can be affected, but it's those other countries, I think, which worry me, particularly Jordan, Egypt, to lesser extent Lebanon, because it's still rebuilding itself. And I think one major issue has to do with revenues from the Suez Canal, which are important for Egypt. And you need to look at how global supply chains will be restructured and whether or not you'll continue to have this flow coming through the Suez Canal if you're putting in trade barriers. So that's an issue. Second issue there is interest rates. With continuing high inflation and probably an increase in inflation in the United States, the Fed will find itself in a position where it might not cut down interest rates. It's going to have to balance between a slowing and potentially recessionary economy, but on the other hand, higher inflation. So it might keep interest rates high, in which case you've got highly indebted countries, Bahrain, Egypt, and others, that are going to suffer because of having to service their foreign debt, their foreign currency debt. So I think those are things that should alarm us.
Okay, and with that being said, then everything that we've spoken about, which currencies in the region are due for maybe a reconsideration in terms of how they manage their exchange rate? We talked about Lebanon, so let's put that aside. But if you can make a recommendation, I mean, basically I'm looking at, for example, what Kuwait did, right? So they moved away from a peg to the dollar to a basket of currencies in 2002. We haven't had anything since. And since the whole world's getting shaken up, maybe people like you begin to think about other possible scenarios. So I want to kind of brainstorm with you now which currency that could be, or whether you say the peg still can serve its purpose even with what's going to come over the next 2 to 3 years.
I think at a time at which you've got these large global shocks, you don't want to expose yourself until you know what the conditions are. So I wouldn't change policy right now. I might want to think of a basket. Yeah, that's possible. And the composition of the basket. So, for example, Kuwait has done fairly well, but maybe the composition of the basket that was viable, say 10 years or 15 years ago, is no longer viable today. So I would have more Chinese renminbi, yuan. I tend to think about digital currencies issued by governments as being increasingly important. So what you need to think of is how do you redesign the payment system and the linkages between financial sectors in this new world. So if you want to think of a vision for the next 10, 15 years, I'd like to see our Gulf countries have deeper and more liquid and linked financial markets. Link those to Asia, in particular Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and at the same time participate in new payment systems which are going to be increasingly based on the yuan, and particularly using the digital market.
You read my mind, because I was going to ask specifically about digital currencies and the pivot towards Asia and China. How is that going to form the basis, though, of sort of non-dollar trade financing, just in terms of the practicalities, right? I know it sort of makes sense in sort of from the point of view of a chief economist, but in terms of like on the ground execution, would you push for it?
Of course. I mean, let's be very clear. China is our major trade partner. So we sell our oil and gas and other petrochemicals and the rest, and we buy Chinese goods, right? We denominate it in dollars, and it goes through the dollar banking system, okay? Which means I pay higher transactions costs. I have exposure, overnight exposure to banks in New York because they're doing the clearing and settlement over there. So it adds to the overall costs and the risk. Whereas today, I can undertake a trade using the digital yuan that'll cost me 7 cents. 7 cents instead of several dollars. Okay?
Wow. Yeah.
So the first step is to say, okay, let's think of oil. Let's start using the petro yuan. So keep the price in dollars so everybody stays happy. But then when you have the dollar price, automatically translate that into a yuan and do the trade in yuan, clearing and settlement in yuan. That's the world we have to head towards. And I think it's in our interest that we do that, because you cut the transactions costs, you cut the banking risks, because it can be instantaneous, right?
Absolutely. And then I wonder, though, in this new world that you describe, what rule book are we using? Because you listen to the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who a few days ago, nothing short of bashed the IMF. I mean, there's no other way to put it, describing it as an organization that has fallen behind, that sort of lost its true north. Doesn't that, get you a little bit sleepless at night when you hear that kind of drum rolling?
Yes, it does, because the reason is that it's getting driven by national security interests at the end of the day. As an economist, I always worry that if you put national security interests as the priority and not economic and financial interests, then the rules of the game are fundamentally changed. And you no longer have a rule of law as we've known it. So that means that you have to be intelligent and innovative in terms of new institutions. So BRICS should play a role. The new development bank out of China should play a role. And you need to have alternative payment systems. And at our level in the GCC and the Arab world, you need to think about more instruments that you can use, swap agreements between central banks, right? A larger role for the Arab Monetary Fund, and I can go on. But the idea is that you need to rethink your organizations, right? And what are the rules of the games for those organizations?
You're also the chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council, Middle East and North Africa, with a lot of focus on renewable energy. I mean, with the rhetoric coming out of the White House on so many levels, I mean, that's a setback as well in itself, isn't it? When you have to operate in that kind of narrative.
I view it as a enormous opportunity. So in my view, the GCC countries are already the major hub globally for oil and gas, right? Okay. They can be the global hub for renewable energy and climate tech and financing climate technologies, okay, which are the biggest threat existentially for us. So here's a big opportunity really for them to become the main global hubs for renewable energy. You already have a comparative advantage in solar, right? And you can export solar. Look at the data centers increasingly. They're going to be solar powered, right? Which makes them clean. Clear way to do it so. But if you focus on financing clean energy, you're going to do it for the rest of the world. If US isolates itself and goes out of the running, it creates more opportunities for you. So I look at it very positively in that we have the technologies. We've got things like desalination, district cooling, solar power, and all the rest. We can be exporters of that technology, not just the financiers. And one final thing, Yusuf, because you're talking about the region, what we didn't talk about is the potential reconstruction. If we have some geopolitical stability in the region, you have a marvelous opportunity of rebuilding many countries that got destroyed by war, right? And the list is a long one. Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Sudan, Yemen, Libya. If you look at all that, what we're talking about is something like $1.5 trillion worth, okay, in terms of reconstruction. And the Gulf countries in particular know how to build infrastructure. They've been doing it now for the past 40 years, right?
Yes, very true.
If anybody knows how to do it, it's the GCC. So if we can get some stability, then we can start a big reconstruction over a coming decade, or maybe even longer.
I think the instrumental word there is if. There's been a lot of saber rattling from all sides involved, and so it's not a reassuring theater at the moment. Far from it. But if we get to that, I can see where you're going with this in terms of the potential. Once you get to the other side, even though it might not be that clear at the moment. I want to get to a bit of a personal segment now, and start off with what got you into economics.
Oh, it's a very specific incident.
I'd love to hear
it. My father emigrated from Lebanon, like many Lebanese. He went to Nigeria. He started off trading, and then eventually he went into the hotel business. So one day during summertime, I was visiting the hotel. He didn't happen to be there. But I was known to be the son of a proprietor, right? So I went down to have dinner, and the head waiter came and told me, what would you like to have? And I remember very well, I asked for some creme caramel to start, and then and a steak, okay? And so some a little shrimp salad to start.
Okay.
And then he brought me the bill, and I think it was something like £1, 10 shillings. They were still using the British pound at the time. And I just said, okay, I'll just sign. I didn't think twice. Next day, my father told me, I'd like you to go through the various departments in the hotel and learn how the hotel works. So I did that, and I ended up in the accounting. I was going through the accounting, and I said, oh, here's this head waiter called Francis, I think his name was. And I looked at his salary. And his monthly salary was £3. And I was shocked. I was ashamed. I said, my little boy, I think it was maybe 13 or 14, went and sat down in one meal, ate a third of his salary. I didn't want to go back to the restaurant again. But then it set me thinking, what is it that leads you to so much inequality and poverty? Why is it that countries don't develop? What is it that makes that happen? And that particular incident made me change later on. I was destined to do philosophy, and had an offer from the Sorbonne, a scholarship from the Sorbonne, which I turned down, and then went into economics.
That was an inspirational story. Who then do you consider the greatest economist?
There are so many, but I can tell you a few that were relevant for me.
Ideally, not more than two.
Bob Lucas is one of them. Milton Friedman is another.
Okay. And of all Lebanese food and drinks, which one is your favorite?
Overall, I mean,
you can again pick two, since instead of one, it can be two. It can be a food and a drink.
Sayadi.
Okay.
Is that, and of course, Arak.
Okay. And then closing question, coffee or tea with or without sugar?
Tea, and definitely without sugar.
All right. Nasser, this has been
Thank you.
very insightful and also fun. So thank you for your patience and your reflections, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got plenty more insightful talks on the way. We cover business, finance, and everything in between.